Former Republican Congressman Will Hurd of Texas joins me now. Congressman Hurd, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right. You knew what you were doing when you went into that room. That was a prepared thing you did, not off the cuff. The reaction you got, was it as expected?
Of course it was as expected. I knew there were going to be people that didn't like it, but what I didn't expect was there were a lot of people that actually clapped, and then there were more people that just sat there politely and probably understand and knew what I was saying was the truth. My goal was not to go in there and talk to the people that, have been frustrated when they're told that the person that they respect has been lying to them. I was there to talk to the people that believe in personal responsibility, that believe character matters, that believe service matters, that believes that the United States has a role in the world and it's important to us back here at home. Those were the people that I was going to speak to, and also to prove to the rest of the field that we're running for an election, and if you're afraid to talk about Donald Trump or talk about his baggage, then you're not ready to be president of the United States. And that's why I need some help. I need folks to go to herdforamerica.com and at least help me with, give me $1 so I can be on the debate stage.
You know, the last time you were here was before you were still trying to decide whether to do this or not. It happened in the week of the defamation suit where it was ruled that Donald Trump would indeed not only defamed her, but the judge seemed to think that, yes, he did rape her. We now have 74 additional criminal charges, plus that civil defamation statement from another court. None of it has mattered to Republican voters. Why?
Well, I don't know why the part of the population that supports Donald Trump, I will say this race will tighten when we get closer to an election. That's what always happens in elections. The place that it is mattering is with independents and conservative Democrats that are frustrated with Joe Biden. If the Republican Party puts Donald Trump forward as our nominee, we will give 4 more years to Joe Biden on purpose. You said in the lead-in, nobody wants to see this rematch. People are looking for something different. And here's what I'm seeing on the ground. I get asked the question, when I'm in places like New Hampshire and Iowa, are my kids going to be able to have good access to good paying jobs? Is a robot going to replace my job? Are we going to win this new Cold War with the Chinese government? These are the kinds of issues that people on the ground want to talk about. And Donald Trump, all he's doing is litigating past elections. When people start learning, when you give money to Donald Trump, it's going to pay his lawyers. $3 out of $4 that Donald Trump raises is going to pay for his legal fees. And people are starting, even folks, Republicans that have voted for Donald Trump twice, recognize that this baggage is hurting him, is going to hurt him in November.
The consensus among most of your colleagues running for president, most of your former colleagues on the House, is that a Justice Department that's led by a former federal judge, Merrick Garland, an FBI that is led by a registered Republican, Chris Christie's former attorney, Christopher Wray, has been weaponized against the right. Is there any evidence of that in your mind?
Well, look, can I make some arguments about some of the things that DOJ and FBI has done over history? Absolutely. But that doesn't change the facts on the ground. Donald Trump is a liar. Donald Trump is a national security threat. Donald Trump willingly knew that he had this country's secrets, and he was trying to tamper with evidence to hide that he had that information. All of those things are true, and that doesn't matter who the head of DOJ or where FBI is. And that's what we have to be honest about. And if we want to change how the DOJ operates or the FBI operates, then we have to win elections. And we're not going to win in November if we nominate Donald Trump.
How would a Hurd administration restore confidence among voters left and right in the Justice Department?
Sure.
How do you do it? Do you change the way we appoint an attorney general?
Well, it starts with appointing people that have immediate respect, right? Who that person or who that
Joe Biden, Merrick Garland was, whatever you think of Joe Biden, in his defense, that's the way he was thinking. He had Democratic polls criticizing him. Hey, you need more of a defender there. Don't put a federal judge there.
Well, but did the population know who Merrick Garland was? No, all they knew about him was he was the dude that was selected to be Supreme Court justice and had to get pulled, right?
Yeah.
So having someone that people trust, and then also requires the DOJ to start making decisions properly and not making mistakes. And the only way you can to rebuild trust is to do the right thing, and then also making sure people trust the broader government as well too. And how do you make it more efficient and deliver better services?
You know, there was a history for a while when presidents wanted to send the message that national security should be bipartisan, you appointed somebody else of the opposite party to defense. Is that the solution here? Republican presidents should appoint Democrats attorney general, and Democratic presidents should find a Republican as attorney general.
Well, I don't think do I believe in that concept? That makes sense. But if the problem is the conservative base is distrustful in leaders, appointing a Democrat is probably not going to be the one that
right.
build that trust. But we can't forget the fact that making sure the government and our elected officials are actually doing what they say and is reflective in their actions.
I want to talk about another candidate running for president, and that is Ron DeSantis. There's
Sure.
a debate about curriculum in the state of Florida. And he is doubling down and defending the idea that slaves developed skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. That is exactly what the curriculum said in Florida. Senator Tim Scott took issue with it, and Ron DeSantis responded. Take a listen.
Slavery was really about separating families, about mutilating humans, and even raping their wives. It was just devastating. So I would hope that every person in our country, and certainly running for president, would appreciate that.
You know, I think part of the reason our country has struggled is because DC Republicans all too often accept false narratives, accept lies that are perpetrated by the left, and to accept the lie that Kamala Harris has been perpetrating even when that has been debunked.
Where are you on this?
Well, I'm glad Tim Scott's following my lead. I was the first Republican to come out and say that slavery is not a jobs program, and anybody that is implying that there was an upside to slavery is insane. And what is even more shocking to me is that everybody has come out. Ron DeSantis's Department of Education doubled down on this. Ron DeSantis has doubled down on this multiple times, and he hasn't said, guess what? This is, and then he wants to blame the people that wrote this and say, I wasn't the one that wrote this. Real leadership would have stepped up and said, hey, there is no upside to slavery. Slavery was not a jobs program. Nobody should imply that's what we did, and we're going to change the language. And this would have been done. But this is one more part of a fact pattern of Ron DeSantis being mean and hateful.
Has he disqualified himself?
Well, I wouldn't. It'd be hard to make the case if Ron DeSantis was the Republican nominee that folks in black and brown communities should support him. Folks in the LGBTQ community won't support him because of his hateful rhetoric towards my friends in the LGBTQ community. And then he hired a guy who had known cases of being anti-Semitic, and then created a video that they tried to propagate on their systems, and then he had to be fired. So this is a trend. One is an exception. Three is a trend, and this is a big problem.
Very quickly, the No Labels movement. Are you supportive of them in general? What they're doing?
So when I was in Congress, I was part of the Problem Solvers Caucus that had a relationship with No Labels. Can a third-party candidate win in the United States? I think that's the case. I think the French President Macron is an example, and the Mexican President Lopez Obrador is another example. But I'm focused on, if we want to get rid of Donald Trump, we got to do it in the primary. And if Republicans want to get rid of Joe Biden, it's not by impeaching him. It's about nominating someone who can win in the general election.
Will you, if it's Trump versus Biden, would you participate in a No Labels ticket?
My focus right now.
You're not ruling it out.
No, my
you
focus.
Just gave me that.
No, sure.
No rule it out answer.
Listen, you know me, Chuck. I'm going to take time and deliberate. I wouldn't want something that would potentially lead to Donald Trump winning. My focus right now is crisscrossing the country and talking about how we need common sense in complicated times, and that the best way we solve our problems is by recognizing we're better together. And that's why I need folks to go to herdforamerica.com and help me get on the debate stage.
You saw I was wrapping up, and you got one more pitch in. Congressman Will Hurd, thanks for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
With you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.